When things started unraveling, I was the last one to see it. It's funny how you can live with someone, share your life with them, and still be blindsided by what they're capable of. Wendy and I had been married for 10 years. I wasn't the perfect husband, but I gave my best. We had Wayne, our 8-year-old son, who had my smile and Wendy's sense of humor. He was the kind of kid who could make you laugh on the worst days. Wayne was our glue, I thought, our reason to stay strong. Life was pretty normal until Wendy's mom got sick. Not the kind of sick where you rest and bounce back, but the kind that scares doctors into giving timelines. It hit Wendy like a wrecking ball. Her mom wasn't just a parent to her. She was her best friend, her sounding board, the person who'd seen her through everything. Watching her go downhill was more than Wendy could handle. At first, it showed in little ways. She'd zone out during conversations or snap at me for no reason. It's just stress, I told myself. She's grieving. Then it got worse. She started drinking. A glass of wine at dinner turned into bottles piling up in the recycling bin. I tried to talk to her about it, but she waved me off. I'm fine, she'd say, with that tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. I noticed she was staying out later and later. Nights when she said she was visiting her mom stretched into the early hours. I'd sit on the couch, flipping channels and pretending not to care, but when the front door finally creaked open, I'd find myself holding my breath. Late again, I'd say, trying to keep my voice even. Wendy would shrug it off. Mom needed me, or Laura and I were talking. She's worried about me. It wasn't completely out of character for Wendy to lean on Laura. She'd been her best friend since college. I didn't question it then. I should have. Wayne noticed too. Kids pick up on these things. Why isn't Mommy home for stories anymore? He asked one night, his eyes wide and searching. I fumbled for an answer. She's busy helping Grandma, I told him. It felt like a betrayal, lying to him, but what could I say? That his mom was disappearing into herself and leaving us behind in the process? The turning point came on a cold Friday night in February. Laura called me out of the blue, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. Kevin, we need to talk about Wendy, she said. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Laura wasn't the type to exaggerate, so if she was calling me in the middle of the night, it wasn't good. She told me everything, how Wendy had been confiding in her during her drunken nights, how she'd been seeing other men, telling herself it was just a way to escape the pain. Laura said she'd tried to reason with her, but Wendy wouldn't listen. She's spiraling, Laura said. She needs help, but she won't admit it. And Kevin, you need to know what's happening before it's too late. I didn't want to believe her. Wendy was my wife, the woman I'd built a life with. She wouldn't do this to us, to Wayne. But deep down, I knew Laura wasn't lying. The signs were all there. I'd just been too scared to connect them. After that call, I sat on the edge of our bed for what felt like hours, staring at the floor. Wendy was passed out in the next room, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. I thought about Wayne, sleeping soundly down the hall, and my chest tightened. I had to protect him from this mess. But how? When I finally packed a bag and walked out the door that night, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. Wayne was asleep, his favorite blanket pulled up to his chin. I kissed his forehead and whispered a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. It's going to be okay. As I stepped into the cold night air, I realized this was just the beginning. I didn't know where we were headed, but one thing was clear. Life as I knew it was over. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the car, parked outside a 24-hour diner, staring at the neon open a sign through the foggy windshield. I wanted to go in, get coffee, maybe a slice of pie, but I couldn't move. My mind was spinning, replaying Laura's words over and over. Wendy had been cheating. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The woman I'd promised to love and grow old with had been with other men, all while I was home, holding things together for her and Wayne. By morning, my anger had overtaken the shock. I wasn't a man who liked confrontations. I'd always been the fix-it guy, the one who smoothed things over, but this needed more than smoothing. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I walked in, Wendy was in the kitchen, her hair a mess and her face pale. She looked up from her coffee, surprised to see me. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice scratchy. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down across from her, watching her shift uncomfortably under my gaze. She looked tired, fragile even, but I wasn't in the mood to feel sorry for her. I told her I knew. I told her Laura had called me and that she'd spilled everything. Every lie, every betrayal, every excuse. Wendy's face went blank, like she'd been caught off guard but didn't have the energy to defend herself. At first, she denied it. She said Laura was exaggerating, that she'd been drunk and emotional and probably made it all sound worse than it was. But when I pressed, when I demanded the truth, the dam broke. Wendy admitted to it. Seeing other men, drinking to numb the pain of losing her mom, feeling trapped in a life she didn't recognize anymore. "It's not about you," she said quietly, like that was supposed to make it hurt less. "It's about me. I'm falling apart. Kevin. I don't know how to deal with it." Her words cut deep, but what hit me harder was her tone. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging for forgiveness. She sounded resigned, like she'd already made peace with the damage she'd done. I asked her if she even cared about us anymore, about Wayne. She looked down at her coffee mug, turning it in her hands. "Of course I care," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to be who you need me to be right now." That's when I realized this wasn't just about her cheating. Wendy wasn't the woman I married anymore, and maybe she never would be again. She was broken, and I didn't know if I could fix her, or if I even wanted to. For Wayne's sake, I knew I couldn't let this spiral any further. I told her we needed to take a break. She couldn't stay in the house, not like this, not around Wayne. I wasn't going to let her chaos seep into his life. Wendy didn't fight me on it. She just nodded, like she'd expected this all along. I found her an apartment the next day, a small, furnished place a few miles away. It wasn't much, but it was clean and quiet, a place where she could focus on getting herself together. I told her I'd cover the rent for now, but it came with conditions. She had to get help, go to rehab if necessary, and start putting herself back together. Wayne took the news harder than I expected. "Where's Mommy going?" he asked when I told him she'd be staying somewhere else for a while. I tried to explain it in a way he'd understand, saying that Mommy needed time to help Grandma and take care of herself. He cried that night, and I hated Wendy for putting us in this position. Still, I knew I couldn't let her mom suffer because of this mess. As much as I wanted to wash my hands of Wendy entirely, her mom was family. She'd always been kind to me, treating me more like a son than a son-in-law. She didn't deserve to face this alone. After dropping Wayne off at my parents' house, I went to see her. She looked worse than I'd imagined, frail and pale, her once lively eyes dull. When I told her I was there to help, she cried. I hadn't seen her cry before, not even when Wendy's dad passed years ago. It hit me then just how alone she must have felt, watching her daughter crumble under the weight of her illness while I was kept in the dark. That day, I made a decision. I'd do whatever I could to help her, not for Wendy, but for Wayne. He deserved to see what family meant, even in the worst of times. But as I settled into this new reality, I couldn't shake the thought that my own family, my marriage, was crumbling before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The house felt hollow without Wayne. His laughter, the sound of him running around pretending to be a superhero, it was all gone. I dropped him off at my parents' place that morning, telling him it was just for a little while. He seemed excited about the change, calling it his vacation, but I could see the questions in his eyes. With Wayne safe, I threw myself into helping Wendy's mom. Her condition was worse than I'd realized. She barely had the energy to get out of bed most days. Her once vibrant voice was now faint, and she struggled to do even the simplest things without assistance. Seeing her like that hurt. This was the woman who used to bake Wayne's favorite cookies and argue with me over which baseball team deserved to win. Now she looked like a shadow of herself. I tried to keep things light when I visited. I'd bring her tea, help her sit up, and talk about Wayne's antics to make her smile. She laughed a little when I told her about his latest obsession with building the biggest Lego tower ever, but the exhaustion was always right there beneath the surface. "Kevin," she said one afternoon, her voice trembling, "you don't have to do all this. After what Wendy's done to you," she trailed off, looking ashamed. I stopped what I was doing and sat down beside her. "Your family," I told her simply. "Wayne loves you, and I'm not about to let you go through this alone." She nodded, tears brimming in her tired eyes. When I wasn't helping her, I worked on the house. The roof had a couple of leaks, the water heater barely worked, and the walls hadn't been painted in years. I patched up what I could, one small fix at a time. It wasn't just about making the house livable, it was about doing something, anything, to feel like I still had control over something in my life. Wendy called sporadically. Her voice on the other end of the line sounded distant, like she was calling from another world. She asked about her mom but never stayed on the phone for long. When she finally visited, it didn't go well. She showed up reeking of alcohol. Her mom didn't say anything, but I could see the pain in her expression. Wendy hugged her awkwardly, muttered a few words, and left after 20 minutes. I watched her walk out the door, her shoulders slumped, and wondered if she even realized how far she'd fallen. That night, after her mom had gone to bed, I sat in the quiet living room and let it all hit me. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the responsibility, the uncertainty, it felt like too much. But then I thought about Wayne. I thought about his smile when I told him we'd visit Grandma soon and how he'd asked if he could bring her flowers. That thought kept me grounded. The next day, I got up early and went to work on the house again. Each repair felt like a small step forward, a way to fight back against the chaos. I couldn't fix Wendy, but I could do this. And for now, that had to be enough. Life settled into a strange rhythm. Mornings were quiet. I'd wake up, drink a cup of coffee alone, and head over to Wendy's mom's house. Each day there was something new to tackle, a doctor's appointment, a prescription to pick up, or another repair to work on. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me moving. Wendy was a ghost in this new version of life. She barely called anymore, and when she did, the conversations were short and strained. She always had an excuse ready. She was busy, or not feeling great, or sorting things out. The promises to visit her mom came less often, and when they did, I stopped expecting her to follow through. One afternoon, as I was fixing a leak under the sink, Wendy's mom cleared her throat. "Kevin," she said softly, "I'm sorry about Wendy. I don't know where I went wrong with her." I sat back, wiping my hands on a towel. "It's not your fault," I told her. "She's dealing with a lot. It doesn't excuse what she's done, but this isn't on you." She didn't seem convinced. She stared out the window, her eyes glassy. "I just thought she'd be stronger than this. I thought I raised her to handle life better." I didn't know what to say to that. In truth, I had wondered the same thing. Wendy wasn't the person I thought she was. Not anymore, at least. But blaming her mom felt wrong. Wendy made her choices, and now we were all dealing with the fallout. Later that evening, Wendy finally called. It had been over a week since her last check-in. She sounded tired, like she'd just woken up from a restless sleep. She asked about her mom, and I gave her the usual update, stable, hanging in there, taking it day by day. I waited for her to ask if she could visit, but she didn't. Instead, she shifted the conversation to Wayne. "Does he ask about me?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Of course," I said. "He misses you. He doesn't understand why you're not around." She sighed heavily. "I'll call him tomorrow. I can't deal with it tonight." I didn't argue. What was the point? After we hung up, I stared at my phone, wondering how we'd gotten here. This wasn't the Wendy I married, the woman who once planned every detail of Wayne's birthday parties and stayed up late helping him with school projects. This Wendy was a stranger, distant, unreliable, and drowning in her own mess. The next morning, Wayne asked me again why his mom wasn't visiting. I told him she was busy helping Grandma, the same excuse I'd been giving for weeks. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was starting to piece things together, even if he didn't have the words for it yet. I made a point to spend more time with him that week. We went to the park, built Lego towers that stretched higher than the coffee table, and made a mess baking cookies that didn't turn out half as good as Wendy's mom's. Wayne laughed through it all, his joy contagious, but at night, when he thought I wasn't watching, I caught him staring at the photo of Wendy on his nightstand. This wasn't just my life unraveling, it was his too. And as much as I wanted to shield him from it all, I couldn't stop the cracks from showing. By the time Wendy called again, almost 2 weeks had passed. I'd stopped holding my breath for her calls, but hearing her name pop up on my screen still made my stomach twist. I answered, expecting the usual small talk and hollow promises, but this time was different. She was slurring her words, clearly drunk. "I need to see Wayne," she said abruptly, her voice unsteady. It's been too long. I closed my eyes and gripped the phone tighter. Wendy, I don't think that's a good idea right now. You're not in the right place for it. Her tone shifted instantly, anger replacing the sadness. You don't get to keep my son from me, she snapped. I'm still his mother. I kept my voice calm, though my patience was wearing thin. I'm not trying to keep him from you, Wendy. But you need to get yourself together before you see him. He doesn't need to see you like this. She didn't respond right away, just muttered something under her breath before hanging up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen. This was the first time she demanded to see Wayne, and the way she'd said it, angry, almost defiant, set off alarms in my head. That weekend, I decided to visit Wendy at the apartment. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but it was worse than I'd imagined. The place was a mess. Empty bottles on the counter, clothes scattered across the floor. Wendy was on the couch, half asleep, with a blanket wrapped around her. When she saw me, she sat up slowly, her eyes bloodshot. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice groggy. "We need to talk," I said, taking a seat across from her. She avoided my gaze, staring at the floor instead. I asked her if she'd taken any steps toward getting help. Therapy, rehab, anything. She shrugged, saying she'd thought about it. That was all I needed to hear. "This can't keep going like this, Wendy," I told her firmly. "You're spiraling, and it's not just affecting you. It's affecting Wayne. He deserves better than this." Her face hardened. "Don't act like you're perfect, Kevin. Like you've never made mistakes." I shook my head, trying to stay composed. "This isn't about me. It's about you and the choices you're making. If you don't start getting serious about fixing this, you're going to lose him. You're going to lose everything." For a moment, I thought I saw something break in her, a flicker of realization or guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She leaned back against the couch and muttered, "I don't need you telling me how to live my life." I left shortly after, the weight of the visit pressing heavily on my shoulders. I wanted to help her, but it was becoming painfully clear that I couldn't force her to change. She had to want it, and right now, she didn't seem to care enough to try. When I got back home, Wayne was waiting for me with a stack of drawings he'd made. Dinosaurs, spaceships, and a few pictures of our family. One of them showed him holding hands with Wendy and me, all of us smiling. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if there was any chance of putting our family back together. But as much as I wished for it, deep down, I knew the answer. Some things were already broken beyond repair. The days started blending together. My mornings were spent helping Wendy's mom, afternoons were filled with Wayne's laughter, and nights were spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I was stuck in a routine I hadn't asked for, trying to hold things together while Wendy unraveled. Wendy's mom had started opening up more during my visits. Some days, she'd reminisce about happier times. Wendy as a little girl, full of life and promise. Other days, she'd apologize again, her voice heavy with regret. "I don't know what I could have done differently," she said one afternoon, clutching the blanket draped over her lap. I told her it wasn't her fault, but the words felt hollow. She nodded anyway, a small, tired smile crossing her face. Despite her fragile state, she still tried to be strong, and I admired her for that. Meanwhile, Wayne was becoming my anchor. He was too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, but he knew enough to sense that things weren't normal. One night, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked up at me and said, "I miss Mommy." It hit me like a punch to the chest. "I know, buddy," I said, brushing his hair back. "She misses you too. She's just busy right now, helping Grandma." "Why can't she come home?" he asked, his big, innocent eyes staring up at me. I didn't know how to answer. I could have told him the truth, but he didn't deserve to carry the weight of that yet. Instead, I kissed his forehead and told him we'd see her soon. That weekend, I decided to bring Wayne with me to visit his grandma. He picked out a bouquet of flowers on the way, bright yellows and reds that he thought she'd like. When we got there, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. She hugged him tightly, her frailty momentarily forgotten. They spent the afternoon talking and laughing, and for a while, it felt like everything might be okay. Wayne showed her his drawings, and she told him stories about when Wendy was his age. It was the most alive I'd seen her in a long time. After we left, Wayne asked if we could visit her more often. I told him we would. If nothing else, it gave him a chance to feel close to Wendy in some way, even if she wasn't there. That night, as I watched Wayne sleep, I realized something. My world had fallen apart, but his still had to keep spinning. He needed stability, love, and a sense of normalcy, even if I had to fake it sometimes. And if Wendy couldn't be the one to give him that, then I would. I had to. But as much as I focused on Wayne, there was still a part of me that couldn't stop hoping Wendy would come back to us. Not just physically, but as the woman I once knew. That hope was fragile, but it was all I had left. A few weeks after my visit to Wendy's apartment, she called again. Her voice sounded different this time, not drunk, not angry, but quieter, almost hesitant. She said she wanted to see Wayne. This time, she didn't demand it, didn't argue or accuse me of keeping him from her. She just asked if she could come by. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect Wayne from the mess she'd become. But another part of me thought about how much he missed her. He deserved to see his mom, even if it was just for a little while. I told her she could come over the next evening. The following day, I prepared Wayne as best I could. I told him Mommy was coming to visit, and his face lit up. Really? Is she staying? He asked, his excitement bubbling over. No, buddy, I said gently. She's just visiting for now. He seemed disappointed but nodded. Can I show her my Lego tower? He asked, already planning what he'd say to her. When Wendy arrived, she looked better than I'd seen her in weeks. Her hair was brushed, her clothes were clean, and her eyes didn't have that glazed-over look I'd gotten used to. She hugged Wayne tightly as soon as she walked through the door, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I married. Wayne chattered non-stop, showing her his tower, his drawings, and the new tricks he'd learned on his bike. Wendy smiled and laughed, but there was a tension in her that she couldn't quite hide. She was trying, but something about her felt fragile, like she was holding herself together with sheer willpower. While Wayne played in the other room, Wendy and I sat at the kitchen table. She fidgeted with her hands, avoiding my eyes. Finally, she said, "I'm going to rehab." I blinked, not sure I'd heard her right. "You are?" She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep living like this. I need help." A mix of relief and skepticism washed over me. I'd been waiting for her to say those words for weeks, but I wasn't sure if I could trust them. "When?" I asked. "Next week," she said. "I found a program. It's out of town, but it's supposed to be good." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to encourage her, to tell her I was proud she was taking this step. But another part of me was cautious, afraid to get my hopes up. I settled on a simple, "That's good, Wendy. It's the right thing to do." She nodded, her eyes glassy. "I'm sorry, Kevin. For everything." It was the first real apology she'd given me since all of this started. I wanted to believe she meant it, but trust doesn't come back that easily. When she left that night, Wayne waved goodbye from the window, asking when she'd visit again. I told him she had some things to take care of first but that she'd come back soon. As I watched her drive away, a flicker of hope sparked inside me. Maybe this was the beginning of something better. Or maybe it was just another false start. Either way, I knew I couldn't rely on her to fix things. I had to keep going for Wayne's sake, no matter what Wendy decided to do next. Wendy left for rehab the following week. She didn't give many details, just said it was a 3-month program and that she'd be out of touch for a while. I dropped her off at the facility, a modest building tucked away on the outskirts of town. As she walked through the doors, she turned back once, gave me a small, uncertain wave, and disappeared inside. The drive home was strangely quiet, even though I had the radio on. I kept glancing at the empty passenger seat, half expecting her to be there, making some sarcastic comment or flipping through her phone. Instead, it was just me, alone with my thoughts. Wayne asked about her that night. "Where's Mommy?" he said, his fork paused mid-air over his plate of spaghetti. "She's getting better," I told him. "She's in a place where people can help her." He frowned, chewing on my words. "Will she be back soon?" "Not for a little while," I said gently. "But she's doing something really important right now." He seemed to accept that, but the conversation left me feeling heavy. How do you explain something so complicated to a child who just wants his mom back? The first week without her was harder than I expected. Not because I missed her, I wasn't sure I even knew how to miss her anymore, but because I kept waiting for something to go wrong. A phone call saying she'd left the program or another excuse about why she couldn't stick with it. But the call never came. I stayed busy to keep my mind off it. Wayne and I spent more time with Wendy's mom, who seemed to brighten up whenever he was around. He'd sit by her bedside, telling her stories about school and showing off his drawings. She'd laugh, her thin hands resting on his as if she could hold on to his energy for just a little longer. One evening, as I was helping her get settled for the night, she looked at me and said, "You're doing a good job with him, Kevin." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to compliments these days. "Thanks," I said, adjusting the pillow behind her. She smiled faintly. "Wendy doesn't know what she's losing. But I see it. You're a good man." I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I was doing enough or if I was just surviving day by day. As the days turned into weeks, life settled into a new kind of normal. Wayne and I fell into a routine: school drop-offs, dinners together, and quiet nights watching cartoons. He stopped asking about Wendy as much, but I could tell she was still on his mind. The only updates I had about Wendy came from the rehab center's automated check-in system. They'd send a brief email every couple of weeks, letting me know she was still there and participating in the program. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep that tiny flicker of hope alive. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when she came back. Would she be better? Would she want to be part of our lives again? Or would this be another temporary fix? Another chapter in a story that kept repeating itself? For now, all I could do was wait and try to keep the pieces together until she decided what kind of future she wanted for herself, and for us. The weeks without Wendy turned into a strange mix of calm and uncertainty. In some ways, life was easier without the chaos she brought into the house. There were no late-night phone calls, no excuses, no heavy tension hanging in the air. But in other ways, her absence felt like a gaping hole, especially for Wayne. He stopped asking about her as often, but I could see her absence weighing on him. He'd leave drawings on her old nightstand, and sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window, like he was waiting for her to walk through the door. It broke my heart. To keep his spirits up, I tried to make life as normal as possible. We went on hikes, built forts in the living room, and baked cookies, though they never came out quite right. One Saturday, we went to the park, just the two of us. Wayne brought his soccer ball, and we spent the afternoon kicking it around. His laugh filled the air, and for a little while, it felt like everything was okay. But even in those moments, there was an undercurrent of doubt. How long could I keep this up? Would Wendy really come back better, or would I have to keep carrying this weight on my own? One evening, while Wayne was doing his homework, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the rehab center. The subject line read, "Progress update. Wendy." I opened it cautiously, half expecting bad news. Instead, it said she was doing well, attending all her sessions, participating in group therapy, and sticking to the program. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of genuine hope. Maybe she was finally taking this seriously. But that hope came with a healthy dose of skepticism. Wendy had always been good at saying the right things, at making people believe she was on the right track, even when she wasn't. Until I saw the change for myself, I couldn't let my guard down. Later that night, as I was tucking Wayne into bed, he looked up at me and asked, "When Mommy comes back, will she be like before?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know, buddy," I said honestly. "But I think she's trying really hard to get better." "Good," he said with a sleepy nod. "I just want her to be happy again." His words stuck with me long after he fell asleep. All Wayne wanted was for his mom to come back as the person she used to be. The mom who played with him, laughed with him, and tucked him in at night. As much as I tried to prepare myself for the worst, part of me wanted to believe that this time would be different. That Wendy would come back and prove me wrong. That we could find a way to piece our family back together. But for now, all I could do was wait. Wait, and hope, and brace myself for whatever came next. It happened on a Saturday morning, the kind of day that felt routine and unremarkable. Wayne and I had made a habit of visiting the farmer's market downtown. It was one of the few places where I could forget about the mess my life had become, even if just for an hour. Wayne loved it. He'd dart from stand to stand, pointing out the brightest fruits and begging for honey sticks. That day, He was particularly excited about a booth selling handmade birdhouses. While he chatted with the older man running the stand, I wandered over to a table filled with jars of homemade jam. The booth was neatly arranged, with little handwritten labels and ribbons tied around the lids. As I reached for a jar of strawberry rhubarb, my hand brushed against someone else's. "Sorry," a soft voice said, and I looked up to see a woman smiling at me. She had dark wavy hair pulled back into a ponytail, and her eyes were a warm shade of brown. She wore a simple green sweater, and there was a faint smudge of flour on her cheek, like she'd just come from baking. "No, my fault," I said, stepping back to give her space. She held up a jar of jam. "This one's my favorite. The peach lavender. You should try it." Her smile was disarming, and for a moment, I forgot how awkward I usually felt around strangers these days. "I'll take your word for it," I said, grabbing the jar she recommended. Wayne appeared at my side just then, holding a brightly painted birdhouse. "Can we get this one, Dad? It's got a little red door." The woman crouched down to Wayne's level, her eyes lighting up. "That's a great choice. Birds love bright colors like that." Wayne beamed at her, clearly pleased with her approval. "You think so?" "Absolutely," she said. "You'll probably have a whole family of birds in no time." As Wayne ran off to pay for the birdhouse, she stood and extended her hand. "I'm Claire, by the way." "Kevin," I said, shaking her hand. She glanced toward Wayne. "Your son's adorable." "Thanks," I said, a bit sheepishly. "He's got a lot of energy." "That's a good thing," she said, her tone kind. "Kids need that." We chatted for a few more minutes, mostly small talk about the market and the jam flavors. She mentioned that she baked for a small cafe in town, which explained the flower on her cheek. When Wayne came bounding back with his birdhouse, Claire gave him a warm goodbye before moving on to another booth. As we walked to the car, Wayne asked, "Who was that lady, Dad?" "Just someone from the market," I said, trying to sound casual. But as I loaded the birdhouse into the trunk, I realized I was still thinking about her smile. It wasn't much, just a brief encounter, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir. Something I hadn't let myself feel in what seemed like forever. Curiosity, maybe even hope. I didn't know it then, but meeting Claire was the start of something new. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but something I couldn't ignore. The following week, life went on as usual, or at least, what had become usual. Wayne and I kept busy with school drop-offs, dinner routines, and the occasional visit to Wendy's mom. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about Claire. It wasn't just her smile or the way she had connected with Wayne so effortlessly. It was how normal it felt talking to her. For the first time in a long while, I hadn't felt like the guy carrying a world of baggage. Around her, I'd felt lighter. That Saturday, Wayne and I found ourselves back at the farmer's market. He was excited about seeing the birdhouse guy again, though I wasn't sure if it was the birdhouses or the candy the man handed out that drew him back. As we wandered through the stalls, I spotted Claire at her booth. She was arranging her jars of jam, humming softly to herself. I debated whether to say hello or just keep walking. Part of me felt silly for even thinking about it. It was just a random moment with a stranger. But another part of me was curious. "Hey," I said, approaching the booth. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Kevin, right? How's the peach lavender working out for you?" "It's great," I said, holding up an empty jar. "You might have created a new addiction." She laughed. A warm, easy sound. "I'll take that as a compliment." Wayne tugged on my sleeve, holding up a jar of raspberry. "Can we try this one, Dad?" Claire leaned over the table, her eyes sparkling. "Good choice. That one's great on pancakes." Wayne grinned. "Already sold." I bought the jar, and as she handed me my change, she asked, "Do you come here often?" "Pretty much every weekend," I said. "Wayne likes it here." "Well, I'm here every Saturday," she said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Feel free to stop by any time. I'm always happy to talk jam." There was something about the way she said it, friendly but with a hint of something more, that caught me off guard. I thanked her and headed off with Wayne, but as we walked away, I couldn't help but glance back. She was helping another customer, her movements confident and easy, like she belonged in that space. Later that night, as Wayne was busy painting his birdhouse, I found myself thinking about Claire again. It had been such a small moment, barely anything, but it felt like a step forward. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a life waiting for me on the other side of all this chaos. I wasn't ready to dive into anything new, not with Wendy still working through rehab and Wayne needing so much of my attention. But meeting Claire had reminded me of something I hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility of starting over. And for now, that was enough. A few more Saturdays passed, and the farmer's market became less about the produce and more about seeing Claire. I tried to tell myself it was harmless, that I was just being polite, enjoying a little adult conversation. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. Each time we talked, I learned a little more about her. She'd grown up a few towns over in a family that sounded like something out of a Hallmark movie. Her parents, now retired, had owned a successful family business, a small chain of specialty bakeries. Claire had spent her childhood surrounded by the warmth of fresh bread and the chatter of loyal customers. They wanted me to take over the business, she told me one morning as we stood by her booth. But I wanted something smaller, more personal. That's why I started baking for the cafe. You walked away from the family empire? I joked. She laughed, brushing flour off her sleeve. Pretty much. They were supportive, though. My dad always said, do what makes you happy, not what makes the most money. Her stories painted a picture of a family so different from mine. Stable, warm, uncomplicated. It made me wonder how someone like her could connect with someone like me. Someone whose life felt like a constant balancing act on shaky ground. One Saturday, as Wayne and I were leaving her booth, she stopped me. Hey, Kevin, she said, a little hesitantly. Would you want to grab coffee sometime? You know, outside of the market. For a moment, I froze. It had been so long since I'd thought about dating, since I'd even considered the idea of opening up to someone new. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid the risk of complicating things even further. But then I looked at her, standing there with that hopeful smile, and I realized I didn't want to say no. Yeah, I said finally. I'd like that. We met the following week at a small cafe near the market. It was quiet, tucked away from the main streets, with mismatched chairs and the kind of atmosphere that made you want to linger. Claire was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the table. I figured I'd save us some time and order ahead, she said with a grin as I sat down. We talked for over an hour, covering everything from her childhood to my work to our shared love of cheesy 80s movies. She told me more about her family, her parents, who still lived in the same house they'd bought when she was a baby, and her older brother, a lawyer who'd inherited the family business. They're a little overbearing sometimes, she admitted with a laugh. But they mean well. And they absolutely love Wayne's drawings, by the way. I showed them the ones you brought to the market last week. Hearing that surprised me. I hadn't realized she'd kept them, let alone shared them with her family. The conversation flowed so easily that I forgot, for a little while, about everything else. About Wendy, the rehab, the weight of my responsibilities. When we finally left the cafe, Claire looked at me and said, "This was nice. I hope we can do it again sometime." "Yeah," I said, meaning it. "Me too." On the drive home, I thought about how easy it had been, how natural it felt to sit across from her and just talk. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was simple, and maybe that's exactly what I needed. That night, as Wayne showed me his latest Lego masterpiece, I realized I was smiling without forcing it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to feel alive again. A few months after Claire and I started seeing each other, she invited Wayne and me to dinner at her parents' house. It was the first time I'd meet them, and while I tried to play it cool, I was nervous. Claire had shared so many stories about her family. Their closeness, their kindness, and the warmth they showed to everyone they welcomed into their lives. I wasn't sure how Wayne and I would fit into a picture that already seemed perfect. The night of the dinner, Claire picked us up and drove us to her parents' home. Wayne was in the back seat, excitedly clutching one of his birdhouse drawings to show them. "Do you think they'll like it?" he asked for the 5th time. "They'll love it," Claire said with a smile, glancing at him in the rear-view mirror. Her parents' house was everything I'd imagined. A charming 2-story home with a big wraparound porch and flower beds bursting with color. Her dad was waiting at the door when we arrived, his face lighting up as soon as he saw us. "You must be Kevin," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "And this must be the artist I've been hearing about." He crouched down to Wayne's level, his warm demeanor instantly putting him at ease. Claire's mom appeared a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel and beaming. She hugged Claire first, then turned to me and Wayne. "It's so nice to finally meet you both," she said, her voice as welcoming as her smile. The dinner was better than I expected. Claire's parents asked plenty of questions about me and Wayne, but they weren't intrusive. They seemed genuinely interested in getting to know us. Wayne charmed them with his stories and proudly presented his drawing, which Claire's mom immediately promised to frame. Over dessert, Claire's dad shared stories about the bakery business and teased Claire about her childhood baking experiments. "She once tried to make chocolate muffins with jelly beans inside," he said, laughing. "We still haven't forgiven her for that one." Claire groaned and rolled her eyes, but she was laughing too, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. As the night wound down, I caught myself relaxing, the nerves I'd felt earlier completely gone. Claire's family wasn't just welcoming, they were the kind of people who made you feel like you belonged. When we left, Wayne was practically bouncing with excitement. "They're so cool," he said as we drove home. "Can we visit them again soon?" I glanced at Claire, who was smiling softly. "I think we can arrange that," she said. A year later, time passed quickly after that night. Wayne and I became regular visitors at Claire's parents' house, and they treated us like part of the family. Claire and I grew closer, and as her presence in our lives deepened, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: stability. Wayne adored Claire, and she had a way of making him feel safe and loved, without ever trying to replace Wendy. She was patient, kind, and endlessly creative, always coming up with new projects to keep him entertained. A year after our first dinner with her family, I proposed to Claire in the park where Wayne and I used to go to clear our heads during the hardest times. It was just the three of us. No grand gestures, no big speeches. I knelt on one knee and told her she made me believe in second chances. She said yes, tears shining in her eyes as Wayne cheered and hugged us both. We got married a few months later in a small ceremony at Claire's parents' house. Wayne was the ring bearer, beaming with pride as he carried the rings down the aisle. Claire's family helped with everything, from decorating to cooking, and my parents joined in, thrilled to see me happy again. As I stood next to Claire that day, looking out at the people who had supported us through so much, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, it felt like the pieces of my life were finally coming together. Wayne ran up to us after the ceremony, throwing his arms around our legs. "Does this mean Claire's part of our family now?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. I looked at Claire, who smiled and nodded. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "She's part of our family forever." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed that things were going to be okay. A year after Claire and I got married, life felt steady in a way I hadn't known in years. Wayne was thriving, happier, more confident, and always looking for ways to make Claire laugh. He still saw Wendy occasionally, though their relationship remained distant and strained. Claire never overstepped but always made sure Wayne felt loved and supported. Our days were filled with simple joys. Weekend trips to the park, movie nights with popcorn spilling everywhere, and Claire's endless stream of baking experiments. The house smelled like home again, not just physically, but emotionally too. One evening, Claire and I were cleaning up after dinner. Wayne had already dashed off to his room, excited to work on a new Lego set. Claire was unusually quiet, her movements slower than usual. "You okay?" I asked, noticing the way she kept glancing at me. She turned, holding a dish towel, her face a mix of nerves and excitement. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. My stomach flipped. "What is it?" She took a deep breath and smiled. "I'm pregnant, Kevin." For a second, I just stared at her, the words not quite sinking in. "Pregnant?" I repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yeah. We're going to have a baby." I didn't realize I was smiling until she laughed and threw her arms around me. I hugged her tightly, my chest filled with a mix of joy, relief, and disbelief. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about how far we'd come. A few years ago, I was picking up the pieces of a life I thought was over. Now, I was starting a new chapter with Claire, one that felt full of hope and possibility. The next morning, we told Wayne. He was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a bowl of cereal, when Claire broke the news. "You're going to be a big brother," she said, her voice gentle but excited. Wayne's spoon froze mid-air, and his eyes widened. Really? Claire nodded, and I added, yeah, buddy. There's going to be a baby in the house soon. A grin spread across his face. Does this mean I get to teach them stuff? Like how to build with Legos? Absolutely, Claire said, ruffling his hair. The months that followed were some of the happiest I could remember. Claire's pregnancy brought a new energy into our home. Wayne took his role as big brother seriously, drawing up lists of names and practicing holding a baby doll Claire's mom had given him. I found myself daydreaming about the future in a way I hadn't before. I thought about holding our baby for the first time, teaching them to ride a bike, and watching Wayne show them how to build the tallest Lego towers. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living, moving forward and building something new. As Claire's belly grew, so did my gratitude. Life had thrown me into chaos, but here I was, starting over with a woman who had brought light into the darkest parts of my life. It wasn't perfect, there were still hard days, lingering doubts, and scars that might never fully heal. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I was happy.